Okay, so are you ready to dive into some seriously wild stuff today?
Always up for a challenge. What do we have?
Well, today we're going deep on CBRN defense.
Ah, CBRN. So that's chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear.
You got it. And it's a lot more timely than some people might think. We're seeing a global landscape shift. And with that, countries are really starting to gear up for potential conflicts, even nuclear ones.
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny that the situation in Ukraine has, well, it's got a lot of people feeling on edge. And then there are the other incidents, like that train derailment in Ohio.
Right, exactly. So we'll be unpacking all of that and more in this deep dive. But, it's not just about nukes and hazmat spills. We're also going to get into some seriously mind-blowing biodefense technology stuff that'll make you think you've stepped into a sci-fi flick.
The future is now, right?
It really seems that way.
What I find really interesting is how all these recent events, like the war in Ukraine and that train derailment we mentioned, have really put these issues front and center.
Yeah.
For years, CBRN preparedness was seen as this niche topic, something that, well, most people didn't really think about. But now it's impossible to ignore. These threats are real.
Absolutely. And to your point about real-world implications, one of the things that really grabbed my attention was this massive CBRN exercise that Poland is planning. They're calling it White Cloud, and it's designed to simulate everything from a small-scale hazmat incident to a full-blown nuclear attack.
Wow.
I know, right? Talk about being prepared for anything.
It's a huge undertaking. From what I understand, the Polish CBRN Defense Directorate is essentially saying, look, the world's a pretty unpredictable place right now. We need to be ready for anything.
Smart.
And I think that really reflects a wider anxiety that we're seeing in many countries, especially those close to Russia, of course.
That's like everyone's realizing those old Cold War playbooks might not cut it anymore, right?
It's incredible, really. I read about some NATO countries. They'd actually been renting out their old nuclear bunkers because the infrastructure had been neglected for so long. Apparently, one decommissioned bunker in the UK was being used by a natural death charity.
Oh, the irony.
That's almost hard to believe. But it just goes to show that for years, a lot of governments just avoided even talking about nuclear preparedness. Like it was taboo or something. Too scary to even think about.
Right. It's like nobody wanted to acknowledge that this was even a possibility.
Exactly. But now, well, events in Ukraine have changed all that, haven't they? Everyone's being forced to confront these issues head on. And it's not just about physical infrastructure either. The Polish Directorate, they're really emphasizing public education and preparedness, which is huge.
So it's not just about governments having these high-tech bunkers. It's about making sure everyday citizens know what to do in a crisis.
Right. Exactly. It's about empowering an individual.
That's something we haven't really grappled with since, well, I guess those old duck and cover drills.
Right. A blast from the past.
It's a huge shift in thinking, for sure. And it kind of begs the question, how prepared do you feel for a potential nuclear event?
It's not about being alarmist, really. It's about being informed, having a plan.
Exactly. It's about being prepared, not scared. All right, so we've covered nuclear threats, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about something a little less, well, apocalyptic. Biodefense innovation. This is where things get really interesting and honestly a little bit mind-blowing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with it. What's got you so excited?
Have you heard of dial-a-threat diagnostics?
No, but I like the sound of it already. What is it, some kind of futuristic bioweapon detection system?
You could say that. It's actually a technology that scientists at DEVCOM-CBC, that's the U.S. Army Combat Capabilities Development Command Chemical Biological Center, are working on.
Catchy name. What are they, like, dialing up diseases on demand now? Just to see what happens.
Not quite, but imagine a device that's as user-friendly as, say, a home pregnancy test.
Okay, I'm with you.
But instead of just one thing, it can test for multiple biological threats at once. And get this, it gives you results in minutes.
Hold on, wait. You're saying I could test for, like, anthrax or Ebola with the same device I use to check if I need another cup of coffee in the morning?
You got it. That's the goal, anyway.
That's incredible. How is that even possible?
Well, it's all thanks to some really cutting-edge synthetic biology. They're using something called CRISPR. You familiar with that?
CRISPR, yeah, vaguely. That's the gene editing thing, right?
Right.
But how does that work with diagnostics?
Right, so it's like this. Imagine you have a lock that's the DNA of, say, a virus, and you need to find the right key. That's where CRISPR comes in. Scientists have designed these CRISPR molecules to be incredibly specific, so they only unlock or bind to the DNA of the exact threat you're looking for.
So it's like a super specific lock and key system for diseases. That's pretty ingenious. But what about the dial a threat part? What does that refer to?
Ah, well, that part refers to the ability to program these CRISPR molecules to target a wide range of threats. It's like having a customizable disease detector. Need to test for a new virus, just reprogram the CRISPR.
Wow. That is seriously next level stuff. It's kind of mind-boggling to think about.
It really is. And to make this whole thing even more portable and user-friendly, they've developed these biofuel cells that use naturally occurring enzymes to generate electricity.
Wait, what? So it's like a tiny power plant built into the diagnostic device itself.
You got it. No need for bulky batteries or external power sources.
So we're talking about a self-powered, super accurate disease detective here. That is amazing. But this all sounds incredibly high-tech. Is this something we'll actually see in the real world anytime soon, or is it still just a pie-in-the-sky research project?
You might be surprised to learn that these types of diagnostics are already being used in some settings, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah, and the goal is to make them even more widely available, not just for the military, but for healthcare in general. Imagine the possibilities.
It would be a game changer, that's for sure. Not just for responding to outbreaks, but also for routine medical care.
Exactly. Early detection saves lives, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just diagnostics either. This whole field of biomanufacturing is tackling another big challenge: supply chain resilience.
Oh, yeah. Suddenly, everyone's a supply chain expert after the past few years.
Right. Between the pandemic and everything else, it's hard not to be. But what's amazing is how they're using the synthetic biology to create these more robust and localized supply chains for essential medical supplies.
So instead of relying on those fragile global networks, we could produce crucial medicines and equipment domestically.
Exactly. On demand, using biomanufacturing.
So it's like 3D printing, but for medicine?
You could say that. And it could
Yeah.
be huge, not just for dealing with pandemics, but for making sure people have access to life-saving treatments, even in the most remote parts of the world.
That's incredible. So we've gone from talking about devastating nuclear threats to personalized biodetectives and on-demand medicine production. It feels like we're living in the future already.
It's a wild world out there, that's for
Mhm.
sure.
It really is. But speaking of the real world, we can't forget about what happened in East Palestine, Ohio, earlier this year. That train derailment and the release of hazardous materials was a stark reminder of the risks involved in transporting these kinds of materials and the importance of being prepared for the unexpected.
Absolutely. And it's something we need to talk about.
Mm.
So how are we going to unpack this complex issue?
Well, to help us with that, we have Glen Rudner joining us. Glenn is an emergency response specialist who has firsthand experience dealing with hazmat incidents, including train derailments.
So he's bringing a wealth of practical knowledge to the table.
Exactly. He's seen these types of incidents firsthand. He understands what it's like to respond to a hazmat situation, the importance of communication, all of it.
So he's not just talking the talk, he's walks the walk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's a big advocate for making sure first responders have the best possible training and resources, which makes sense if you think about it.
Right. You want the people responding to these incidents to be as prepared as possible. What kind of training and resources is he talking about?
Well, he's a big proponent of programs like Transcaer, that stands for Transportation Community Awareness and Emergency Response.
Okay, I've heard of Transcaer. It's a voluntary outreach effort, right?
Mhm.
Focused on educating communities and emergency responders about the safe handling and transportation of hazardous materials.
Exactly. It's about getting everyone on the same page.
Right, making sure communities and first responders are all working together. Because in those kinds of situations, clear communication is key.
Absolutely. And speaking of which, he also mentioned AskRail.
That's very cool.
It's the system that can quickly give first responders critical information about what a train is carrying in case of an accident.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would be incredibly useful, especially in those first few critical moments after an accident. Knowing exactly what they're dealing with could mean the difference between life and death.
He also highlighted the rail crossing locator.
What does that do?
It helps first responders quickly figure out their location and contact rail operators, which can be crucial in those situations where every second counts.
So it's about having the right information at your fingertips when you need it most. Makes sense.
Yeah.
But beyond all the technology and the training, did he talk about the human element at all? Because that's got to be a huge part of this too, right?
He did. He emphasized how important clear and consistent communication is during these types of events, especially in the initial hours and days afterwards.
That's really interesting because I remember when East Palestine happened, there was so much confusion and conflicting information going around. It felt like nobody really knew what was going on.
And that lack of clear communication can be incredibly damaging, not just for public safety, but for public trust, too.
It's like that old saying, rumors grow in the absence of information. So in Glenn's view, what went wrong in East Palestine? Was it a communication breakdown from the start?
Well, he believes that while the initial response was actually handled quite well given the circumstances, it was the communication in the days and weeks that followed that really amplified things.
So what happened? What went wrong with the communication?
Well, take the controlled burn of the vinyl chloride, for example.
Right.
While that was deemed necessary at the time, the way it was communicated to the residents wasn't great. This lack of transparency about what was happening and why it created a lot of fear and mistrust, and understandably so.
Of course. I
Yeah.
mean, if I saw a giant plume of smoke coming from a train derailment near my house, you can bet I'd want to know exactly what was burning and why. So how do you prevent that kind of communication breakdown from happening?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something that Glenn feels very strongly about.
Well, he's got a point. Especially with social media and the 24/7 news cycle, things can spiral out of control pretty quickly if there's even a whiff of uncertainty or conflicting information.
It's a classic case of even the best-laid plans falling apart without clear and honest communication. And I think East Palestine is a cautionary tale about a lot more than just hazmat spills. It's a story about the importance of transparency and trust, especially in times of crisis. You need to have that foundation of trust already built before disaster strikes.
Okay, so we've talked about preparing for potential disasters. But what about the institutions that are already on the front lines of CBRN defense? You know, the ones working behind the scenes to keep us safe.
Well, that brings us to Oak Ridge National Lab.
Ah, Oak Ridge. They've got such an interesting history.
Most people associate them with the Manhattan Project.
Right, the development of the atomic bomb.
Exactly. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Oak Ridge has evolved into this hub for all sorts of scientific research, including, you guessed it, CBRN defense.
So they're not just about nukes anymore.
Nope. They're involved in everything from developing new technologies for detecting and responding to threats, to training first responders, to researching how to make our communities more resilient.
So it's a very holistic approach to CBRN defense. They're not just focused on one aspect of the problem, but on the big picture.
Exactly. And one of the things that really impressed me is their work on population mapping and modeling.
What do you mean?
They've developed this incredibly sophisticated model called Landscan.
Landscan? What's
Yeah.
that?
Basically, it's a system that uses all sorts of data, satellite imagery, census data, even things like building permits to create this incredibly detailed picture of where people are located and how they move throughout the day.
Hold on. Are you saying they can predict how many people are likely to be in a specific location at any given time?
Pretty much. It's all about data analysis and predictive modeling.
It's like Google Maps for emergency planning.
Exactly. And they've actually used Landscan in a bunch of real-world situations, including during the COVID-19 pandemic.
How so?
They used it to track how hospitals and other critical facilities were being utilized, which helped with allocating resources more effectively.
Wow, that's remarkable. This abstract scientific model suddenly becomes a critical tool for, well, potentially saving lives.
And that's what's so interesting about Oak Ridge. They're able to take these complex scientific concepts and actually turn them into real-world solutions. They're not just stuck in an ivory tower, you know?
No, it sounds like they're very much focused on making sure their research has a tangible impact.
They are. And their work on transportation security is another great example. Have you heard of T-STAR?
Keystar. Rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
It stands for Transportation Security, Tracking, and Reporting.
Okay, that's it. They use it to track shipments of nuclear material, right?
Right. It's designed to secure and track shipments of radioactive materials. It combines tracking technology and sensors that can detect if a shipment has been tampered with.
So it's like a high-tech security system for really, really dangerous stuff.
Exactly. And it's especially important now with the threat of nuclear terrorism being a very real concern.
Right. You want to make sure that stuff doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So how does T-Star work? Is it just about tracking devices?
It uses a combination of things, actually. There are the tracking devices, of course, but also things like tamper-evident seals and sensors that can detect changes in radiation levels.
So if someone tries to mess with a shipment, T-Star will know about it.
Exactly. It's like having a digital watchdog that never sleeps.
That's reassuring, especially these days when it seems like dangerous information or materials can cross borders so easily.
And the coolest thing is they're even exploring ways to use commercially available tech to make T-Star more accessible and affordable. So it's not just about developing cutting-edge technology, it's about making sure that tech gets into the hands of the people who need it most.
That's really important. I mean, it's one thing to invent something amazing in a lab, but it's another thing entirely to make it practical and affordable for widespread use.
Right. And speaking of practical applications, one of the things I find most impressive about Oak Ridge is their dedication to training. They have this incredible facility there called the Oak Ridge Enhanced Technology and Training Center, or ORIT-TC for short.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
What do they do at ORTC? Is it like a CBRN boot camp?
Kind of. It's basically a training ground for first responders who might have to deal with radiological incidents.
So firefighters, hazmat teams, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And the training they get is really something. It's not just about learning the theory behind radiation. It's about getting hands-on experience with equipment, running through simulations, even participating in real-world scenarios.
Wow. So they're really put through the ringer.
They are, but there's a good reason for it. These are the people who are going to be on the front lines if there's ever a radiological incident. They need to be prepared for anything. And Oak Ridge takes that responsibility very seriously.
Rightfully so. But it's not just about the technical aspects either, right? There's the human element too.
Exactly. Oak Ridge really emphasizes things like communication, teamwork, and even stress management, because at the end of the day, these are people who are putting their lives on the line to keep us safe.
It's a tough job, and it takes a special kind of person to do it. So hats off to all the first responders out there, and to Oak Ridge for giving them the tools and training they need to do their jobs effectively.
Okay, so we've talked about nuclear threats, biodefense, hazmat disasters, and the work being done at Oak Ridge. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground, but I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface of this whole CBRN thing, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
CBRN defense is a huge and complex field, and it's constantly evolving.
Which is why we're here to break it all down for you.
It's way bigger than what most people realize. CBRN defense, it's not just one thing. It's this whole intricate
A web.
of research and technology. You've got global cooperation, all these moving parts.
And it sounds like things are shifting too. From what we've seen so far, it seems like there's more emphasis on collaboration these days.
You're absolutely right. Organizations like Oak Ridge, they're not hoarding knowledge, which is great.
Yeah.
They're all about working with international partners, building up capacity in other countries.
So it's a global effort to tackle, well, global challenges.
Exactly. Because a biothreat in one place can easily become a threat everywhere else, right?
Oh.
But it's not just governments and these national labs that are stepping up. There's another player in the game.
You mean the private sector? They're getting involved in CBRN defense too.
Big time. We're seeing tons of innovation happening in the private sector right now. Companies developing new technologies, new solutions, everything from biodetection to decontamination, you name it.
That makes sense. I mean, there's got to be a market for this kind of technology.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because as these technologies keep advancing and become more accessible to everyone, not just governments, it's going to have some major implications.
Okay, paint me a picture. What kind of implications are we talking about here?
Well, think about diagnostics for a second.
Okay.
Imagine being able to get a personalized diagnostic test for anything right at home.
Wait, like I wouldn't even have to go to the doctor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it would be affordable, too. We're talking cheaper than a smartphone.
Sign me up. No more waiting weeks for test results or deciphering medical jargon.
It would revolutionize the healthcare industry as we know it.
Totally. But we're also talking about biomanufacturing, right?
Right. That could completely change the game for how we produce, well, pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Sustainable fuels, new materials, even custom-designed organs.
Hold on, custom-designed organs. Now that's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But it's closer than you might think. All thanks to these crazy advancements in CDRN defense.
So how does CBRN tie into organ manufacturing?
Because at its core, CBRN defense is all about understanding how biological systems work at their most fundamental level and then manipulating them. And that knowledge can be applied to pretty much any industry you can think of.
Okay, so we're not just talking about protecting ourselves from some scary threat. We're talking about using this knowledge to solve some of the biggest challenges facing our world.
Exactly. And that's what makes this field so exciting. It's about pushing those boundaries of science and technology, to create a safer, healthier, more sustainable future for everyone.
It does sound pretty incredible when you put it like that. But of course, we've got to talk about the risks, right? I mean, we've seen what happens when powerful technology falls into the wrong hands.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. But it's definitely something we need to be thinking about very carefully.
So, what can we do? How do we deal with the potential dark side of this technology?
It's going to require a team effort. Governments, scientists, ethicists, the public, everyone needs to work together to make sure these technologies are developed and used responsibly.
So, it's not just about the science itself, it's about how we manage it.
Exactly. It's about the ethical considerations, too. We need to be having those tough conversations about who has access to this technology, how it's being used, what safeguards are in place.
And these conversations need to be happening everywhere.
Exactly. Government agencies, research labs, even just around the dinner table.
So, what you're saying is we all have a role to play in shaping the future of biodefense?
100%. Because at the end of the day, these technologies are going to impact every single one of us. So we need to make sure they're used for good.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
Couldn't agree more. The more we know, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions about the future.
Well said. We've gone from discussing this massive CBRN exercise in Poland to Oak Ridge's work to the potential of biomanufacturing. And it's clear that this is a rapidly evolving field. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it can feel overwhelming at times, for sure. But that's why it's so important to have these conversations to educate ourselves and each other.
So let's take a moment to recap. We've talked about the exciting potential of biodefense innovations, but also the very real risks they pose. So where do we go from here?
That's the perfect segue to our provocative thought for this deep dive. Here's something to chew on. As this biodefense technology keeps advancing, it's not just going to be governments that have access to it. So how is that going to impact your life in the coming years? We're talking about everything from personalized medicine to potential risks that we need to be aware of. It's a lot to consider.
Okay, so break that down for me. What could this actually look like in the next decade or two, say?
Well, for starters, imagine a world where you can get a personalized diagnostic test for anything, right in your own home.
Like I wouldn't even need to see a doctor.
Exactly. No more doctor's appointments for every sniffle or cough. And these tests would be as easy to use as, say, your smartphone.
Okay, yeah, that would be a game changer. No more waiting weeks for test results.
Right. Healthcare would be completely revolutionized.
Yeah.
And then there's biomanufacturing.
Oh, okay, right. We talked about that earlier, 3D printing organs, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Imagine a world where we can produce sustainable fuels, new materials, even those custom-designed organs, all on demand.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. But we've also got to consider the potential downsides. What happens if this technology falls into the wrong hands, right?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at earlier. It's like every sci-fi movie where the amazing tech ends up being used for evil.
Exactly. Could we see an increase in bioterrorism? Or even just the accidental release of a really dangerous engineered pathogen? These are things we have to think about.
So how do we prevent that? How do we make sure that this technology is used for good and not for, well, bad?
There's no single answer, unfortunately. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We need strong regulations globally for starters. Responsible research practices are crucial. And of course, an open and honest discussion about the ethical implications of this technology.
So it's not just about the science itself, it's about the ethics of it all.
Absolutely. We need to be asking the tough questions. Who should have access to this technology? How should it be used? What kind of safeguards do we need to put in place?
And these aren't just questions for scientists and policymakers.
Exactly. Everyone has a role to play in this conversation. Because ultimately, the future of this technology, how it impacts our world, it's up to all of us.
Wow. That's a lot to process, honestly.
Yeah.
We've gone from this potential for global conflict to the incredible promise of bioinnovation and the very real risks that come with it.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, that's for sure. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that the world is changing faster than ever before. And the more we understand these issues, the better prepared we'll be to face the challenges and hopefully reap the benefits.
Well said. To our listeners, that's your call to action. Stay informed, keep asking those tough questions, because the future's coming, ready or not.
You got it. And who knows, Maybe one of our listeners will be the one to develop the next groundbreaking biodefense technology or help to guide its use in an ethical and responsible way.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. And remember, the conversation never really ends. Keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.